Greetings and welcome to another edition of KSOL Black Talk Radio, the new black media. Family, this video is about the Miscegenation Controversy of 1864. But before we get started, let's take a look at exactly what we're talking about when we discuss the word miscegenation. Family, I'm just going to use this definition that is going to be taken from the biblical scripture, Exodus 34, verse 12 through 16. Anyways, it starts off, first of all, miscegenation is racial intermarriage. It starts off, quote, "Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, or it will become a snare in your midst." Now, before we continue, let's take a look at what that actually means about or it will become a snare in your midst. There are two words in particular that I found quite interesting when they actually define the word snare, the noun, either the word trap or noose. Trap or noose. So let's put that in perspective when they use the word snare as meaning the word trap or noose. Again, I find it quite interesting that they use those two words to describe the word snare. But let's continue. So it says, "Watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, or it will become a trap in your midst. But rather you are to tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and cut down their Asherim. For you shall not worship any god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." So family, you get the gist of where I'm going with this story. This story is purely about race mixing and exactly how the people back in 1864 thought and felt about race mixing. As you can see in this picture here, we're going to get to the actual meaning of this picture because you could best believe that this event actually took place, where you see a whole lot of white men adoring the time and pleasure of black belles, as they called them. And we'll get to that. So anyways, the Miscegenation Controversy of 1864. Late in December 1863, a 72-page booklet entitled Miscegenation, the Theory of the Blending of the Races Applied to the American White Man and Negro, appeared in a few eastern cities. At a glance, it seemed that the anonymous author, who recommended a program of systematic race mixing as a cure for all the nation's race problems, was an overzealous abolitionist. In reality, it was written by two racists in an effort to discredit the Republican Party. The booklet attracted little attention for several weeks. No one had ever heard the word miscegenation before. Well, the authors of Miscegenation were David Goodman Crowley and George Wakeman, both of the New York World. Crowley, born in Ireland, grew up in New York City and had worked for two of the city's leading newspapers, the Evening Post and the Herald. Miscegenation, ostensibly an abolitionist plea for the planned mixing of races, stated, quote, "If any fact is well established in history, it is the miscegenetic or mixed races are much superior mentally, physically, and morally to those pure or unmixed," unquote. It was the melting pot character of the American population, the authors continued, that accounted for the greatness of our race. All that Americans needed to become, quote, "the finest race on earth," unquote, was the Negro element which Providence had placed by our side, unquote. If we failed to mix, we would become weak and degenerate. But if we mingled, we would become, quote, powerful, prosperous, and progressive, unquote. Now, family, I want to stop right there for a minute and give thought to that for a second. So basically, family, that was a mouthful. What they're saying is that they cannot be powerful or prosperous or progressive without the mixing of our blood with theirs, without the mixing of our races, the blending of both black and white. They feel that this is how they will be powerful, prosperous, and progressive. These are the words that were written down way before me doing this video. I'm just reporting it for you. But let's continue. Miscegenation, the booklet continued, would help certain groups more than others. Among those expected to benefit most were the Irish, who, if they were ever to overcome the problems of urban poverty, had to mingle with Negroes. The fusion, whenever it takes place, will be one of infinite service to the Irish, the author said. Indeed, poor Irish women were already attracted to black men. As Crowley well knew, few white Americans would be more enraged by the suggestion that their women breed with Negroes than the Irish immigrants. So they felt the Irish had nothing to lose. The Southern white woman held in her heart a secret passion to be in the arms of a black man, but prejudice, pride, and tradition had prevented their union. The full mystery of sex, the sweet, wild dream of a perfect love, which will embrace all that is fervid and emotional in humanity, can never be generally known until men and women the world over are free to form unions with their opposites in color and race, unquote. Miscegenation would eliminate race prejudice itself, they insisted, because it would rid the country both of the objects of prejudice, the Negroes, and the bearers of prejudice, the whites. If all future generations were brown, complete brotherly love would prevail. Abolitionist Wendell Phillips said the same thing. The, quote, mingling of races, unquote, was the only solution to the race problem. But hardly a year had passed when, in an introduction to a reprint of the speech in his book, 8 Years in Congress, Cox openly acknowledged the fraudulent nature of miscegenation. The Detroit Free Press of February 24th, in reporting Cox's speech, pointed to the ironic fact that only a few years earlier, racial amalgamation resulting from unions between slaves and masters had been one of the most popular arguments against slavery, but now it was apparently advocated by abolitionists as, quote, the great and ultimate good to result from the horrors of radical life. The principle of miscegenation had become doctrine and dogma of the Republican Party. Frederick Douglass had once said, the races will blend, coalesce, and become homogeneous. Shortly after its indictment of Brown and Smith, the world quoted the press as having said, quote, to solve the Negro problem, we must make away with the colored race by absorbing it in the white, unquote. Moreover, the world charged the leading Negro newspaper in the North, the Anglo-African, had demanded a mulatto nation. Black men and women were, quote, ready to amalgamate, unquote. The editor declared all that was needed to guarantee a new age of gold-colored people was to re-elect a Republican administration in Congress. Two fears underlay the racist outcry against miscegenation, fears that had usually been at the bottom of other racist campaigns, namely the fear that the sanctity of white women would be lost, and the fear that the white race would be mongrelized. Naomi Goldstein, in The Roots of Prejudice Against the Negro in the United States, Boston, 1948, wrote that in America, the main focus in interracial problems is placed upon sexual relations. She mentioned three reasons: the idea that the white man has an innate antipathy, to any kind of interracial sexual relations, fears of Negro superiority in sexual prowess and vigor, and the fear of mongrellism. The favorite tool in the racist bag of tricks was the idea of a brutish black man and a delicate white maiden engaged in the unthinkable act, interracial copulation. Actual rapes committed by Negroes were relatively uncommon, but the racists sought them out and embroidered them gleefully. You know, similar to how they do today, where you have a whole bunch of sexual predators who are of European descent, but they brush those under the rug, and then they find those who are done by black men like Bill Cosby, and they make sure that he pays dearly for his transgressions. But I digress. Critics tried to prove that mongrellism had ruined past civilizations. The Egyptians had been a fine and noble Caucasian race until they began mixing with the inferior races among them. Van Eerie claimed. Well, let me just stop right there. You know, the Europeans, when they tell their stories, they always interject their lies wherever they see fit. And in this story here, they try to interject that lie once again, that the ancient Egyptians were white. And as I've shown you, my subscribers, in several of my other videos, it's impossible that the ancient Egyptians were ever white. It is impossible. No way, Jose, nada, zero, wasn't ever, point blank, period. But I digress. Continuing on, it says, secondly, the Carthaginians had become miscegenationists, mingling with the Negro tribes on their borders, and this had hastened their destruction. Destruction was just punishment for the unnatural and beastly crime of miscegenation. Well, let me state one other point that I want to make on that. Since they wanted to put that on record, let me turn the record around and put the mirror up to your face. That is the truth, that it was the destruction of those civilizations, but it was the other way around. Those black civilizations were destroyed because of the white populations who came and invaded and destroyed those civilizations. Those civilizations were black civilizations, including that of ancient Egypt. The people who built the pyramids, the Sphinx, the obelisk, the labyrinths, and every other structure known to man on the African continent. But I digress. But the confusion grew worse when abolitionists and racists began to look for the sources of the existing mulatto population. For decades, anti-slavery spokesmen had pointed to the southern slave owner. It was the master and his white sons who were responsible for the half-breeds of the nation, they said. They had taken advantage of the dependent, defenseless black woman. There were several 100,000 mulattoes in the United States, Greeley pointed out, and there was little doubt that the fathers of at least 9/10 of them were Southern Democrats. Wow. Now that was a clincher right there, family. I know you just heard exactly what I just reported. You heard it here at KSOL Black Talk Radio, the new black media. Significantly, both kinds of racists ignored the hard facts that slavery had done far more to mongrelize the United States than all the words and deeds of the abolitionists. However, according to Myria Lockett Avery, a Southern white woman who wrote her memoirs in 1906, listen to this: the responsibility for antebellum miscegenation did not belong to the morally weak white man, she says, but rather to the slave woman, that black wench, who presented him with an irresistible temptation. The racists denied that the slave owners had any responsibility. Of course, that's what racists do. They always deny the hard facts and truths. And they made countercharges of their own. McCrae, nonetheless, saw the total destruction of black womanhood as the most terrible injustice of slavery. And well, although that is debatable, I could say that that would likely be a cold, hard truth. Mrs. Avery's painfully contrived explanation was nothing more than a manifestation of the agony Southern white women had long endured in silence while their husbands were philandering. Hashtag facts. In other words, this white woman was very scorned. She was mad at the black woman for her husband being out there philandering around with them instead of with her, the white woman. She felt threatened by this black woman, and I would imagine that that threat lingers on right today in the 21st century, but I digress. I told you we would get back to this picture of all these black belles and these white gentlemen, if that's what you want to call them, as they philander around and have a good time at the miscegenation ball, because that's exactly what this is. So, practical application of the miscegenation theory. In a first-page article entitled Miscegenation in Earnest, the World described the affair as a, quote, Negro ball, unquote, where white men and colored belles took liberties with each other. Some of the ladies were octoroon, a reporter observed. To suit, we suppose, the love-sick glances of the Republicans. Published by the Democratic National Committee, quote, full 150 of coal-black wenches tripped gracefully on the fantastic light toe, some on the platform, and more on the benches. Each damsel squeezed tightly her Republican beau. On the rostrum they sat, both ogling and teasing, and some waddled lazily round the hall. The smell was so strong that it set us a-sneezing, so we started away from the Miscegenation ball. Like the World, the Albany Atlas and Argus called the affair a Negro ball, and said that after leading Republicans dance with ebony damsels, they spent the remainder of the evening, quote, miscegenating with the copper faces, unquote. The object of the miscegenation scare was to discredit the Republicans. The closer the critics could tie Abraham Lincoln to race mixing, the more effective they thought their campaign would be. A few months before the publication of Miscegenation, Van Every's old guard implied that the president himself might be the product of a mixed marriage, and in March 1864, the Indianapolis State Sentinel accused Lincoln of, quote, openly and publicly endorsing intermarriage. In September, after Lincoln had received Frederick Douglass at the White House, the World reported that Douglass had said the president welcomed him with praiseworthy cordiality. The editor then went on to accuse the president of supporting the viewpoint elaborated in Miscegenation. Van Every declared that every man who voted for Old Abe would also be a miscegenationist or Negro mixer. So family, I'm going to end this video off here. This video was about race mixing. I was taking a different stance, just showing you something that took place actually in history. Again, this was a major controversy back during 1864, as I stated in the beginning of this video. I hope you like and share it. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe on your way out. Thanks again for watching KSOL Black Talk Radio, the new black media. Peace out.